Well, hello there, Ally.
Hello, Jen. Welcome to another Unscripted with us.
I know. You know what's funny is that before, just like maybe 10 minutes ago, I was like, I haven't really given thought through of what this conversation will be. And I was like, that's why it's called Unscripted. There's no script.
There's no script. There's no script, and there's very loose pre-planning. That's true, y'all. we're gonna make next month on the tail end of this one, and probably not look at it again until we show up.
That's exactly what happens. But it works because I think there's number one, we know our stuff. And number two, I think there's an honesty in not having to have things prepared in such a detailed type of way, personally.
Well, yeah. Plus, nobody wants to listen to anybody be all stiff and formal and dry.
Yeah,
I don't want it.
Not our style. Nope.
No, and today, our conversation is a juicy one. Though before we jump into today's conversation, last month's we could have gone on for like hours. So last month we did copyright issues and AI stuff. That was a real great conversation. So for people who are tuning in today are going to tune in later on. They should really go back, find one of our channels, YouTube, LinkedIn, and check out that conversation. I thought that was super, super important. But then we've also covered things like getting more bang for your book, the revenue generating opportunities. That one was in March. And that had tons of really useful insights and advice and suggestions. So we've been bringing it, like unscripted or not, we've been bringing our A games to this conversation, if I do say so myself. Pat on the back.
I fully agree. And we will continue to bring our A game because there's so much to cover. And I feel like you said, at the tail end of this one, we'll figure out all right, what do we want to talk about next month? But I feel like there's just so many questions that whether someone's a new author, just started writing, just started publishing, wherever they are, or someone who's done it 4 or 5 times even, I feel like there's no shortage of questions or confusion around so many of the things that I feel like we do, again, pat ourselves on the back, do a good job at kind of unpacking and helping people just understand it in a very relatable way versus kind of being academic and talking down at people. It's listen, we're speaking from legitimate experience. And in this case, we're talking about memoirs today. That is absolutely true for both the ghostwriting, the publishing, and then also both of us have written a memoir. So I feel like it's really relatable at this point.
100%. I do want to say too, though, so folks, so we're talking about the whole using real names, which is a really big thing in memoir. But we also want to identify, right, that if you're coming to this as just a nonfiction author, you're probably also wondering, right, about names, because you might be wanting to talk about a colleague, or you might want to name drop somebody who is important on your path to entrepreneurship, depending on what your case may be. So while we are coming to it today a little bit more from a personal writing perspective, which is a little more memoir heavy, a lot of what we have to share is just as true for nonfiction. And I think it's great that if you've been following us along, you both know that Jen and I are way more similar than even we realized before we started doing this. Yeah. So we both have memoirs. We also both have books on writing nonfiction. And we also either coach or publish in nonfiction spaces. So we are 100% aligned. We've got tons that we can say about this topic. We really want you to be dropping your questions into the comments. That, to me, and I won't speak for Jen, but I won't be surprised if she says me too, my favorite part of Unscripted with Ally and Jen are the people who show up live and drop stuff into the comments for us to respond to, because it is so much better to actually serve people where they're at than just assume what they need and be talking and talking and talking based on what our agenda is, even though we can fill the silence quite easily.
Always. But yes, I couldn't agree more. So anyone who is watching us live, and what's interesting is that we're using a platform called StreamYard, and it gives us data on who's watching if they're on YouTube. But if you're on LinkedIn, we have no data whatsoever. So we don't know until after we are done being live how many people are watching, for example. So please use the comments. Even if you're just watching, just say a quick hello. That way we know you're here, and, have questions that you're noodling on, just hit us with it. Don't have to wait for us to have a break in silence, because that is a rarity around here. So just drop it as it comes to you.
Yep. Drop it like it's hot. So today we're dropping it like it's hot all around. Do you use real names or do you not use real names? So there's so many ways to enter into this conversation, but let's just start with typical concerns and worries that authors who are writing nonfiction, especially memoir, have. Jen, what comes to mind?
So many things. The fireworks are already going. So maybe we'll popcorn. I'll say one, you say one. So
Okay.
First thing that comes to my mind is, if I use someone's real name, am I going to be sued?
Yes, 100%. If I talk about somebody who's still alive, am I going to piss them off?
Is publishing, is putting this content out into the world through my lens, inadvertently sharing someone else's story that I have now named? And do I have to change their name because of that? Because I don't want to out them.
I have to get their explicit permission to write about them.
Yeah. Do I have to change everybody's name, or can I leave some people's name real and have to change others?
If I make that decision, where and how do I let the reader know that I've changed some and not others? And do I have to identify those that I have changed and those that I have not?
If I thank those in my acknowledgments and maybe I've changed their name, do I have to then change their name in the acknowledgments too?
If I have previously sued someone for the thing that I am now writing about, can I still name them in the book, or am I likely to be sued in return?
Oh, that's a good one. If I am writing about a family member that could be easily identified, do I still have to seek permission, and or is it useless to change their name?
Yeah. Am I able to name someone else in my industry or field that's similar to me, whether I agree or disagree with their perspective?
And if so, do I have to get their permission?
Yeah. So, all right, we're going to stop there because we could go on and on and on all day. There are so many parts to this this one question about naming, and a lot of it has to do with permission for one, but also fear, right? Like, fear is driving every single one of these questions. Fear of getting other people upset, fear of people suing them, fear of airing other people's laundry, right? Fear. And then, like, where is the line of, I have the right to say whatever I want to say regardless, and I've just infringed on somebody else's privacy, or telling pieces of their story that I shouldn't be, etc. So where do we want to start, Jen? Where do we want to start to pick apart some of these concerns that folks have?
I wonder if it makes sense to maybe start on the legal side, not like full down the rabbit hole, but because I think that tends to be like the biggest concern, is that someone is afraid that whether it's to be directly sued or for somebody to come forward and make some kind of claim that then makes you have to take your work down. I think it's like, it's a little bit of both of those things. It seems to be the biggest concern that I experience.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to kind of do a couple things at once, folks who are paying attention. There's probably going to be a little bit of storytelling and anecdote in here, but also some tips, tricks, tools for you to consider when you're kind of approaching this question for your own work. And I do want to say that this is a very nuanced kind of question. It is going to be a little bit different for every single project, because we can't know here today, like, well, how detailed are you going to get in your descriptions of these people? How often are you going to use that person's name? Are they a central character or a secondary character? What exactly did you say? How did you say it, right? All of which comes into play when determining where are you on the line of, like, it's okay, it's not okay. So take all of this with a grain of salt, that really talking to a professional coach, editor, publisher is one piece of the puzzle. No matter what we say here today, you should be doing that. But also, too, if you are truly concerned about the legal ramifications of something that you are going to say, then please seek out an attorney's perspective and opinion. It will be a beautiful investment into your peace of mind and covering your ass, and totally worth doing. And I can share a story about that later, but that's like that's the first line of defense that I want to throw out there, is that you should be checking with people and talking about your concerns and talking specifically about your question and your project to get the best answer. Don't just rely on what we're saying here today and like decide like, oh, they said, check it off the box.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. That is our legal disclaimer.
Seek professional help. So I'm going to use an anecdote here. I have a client whose book's coming out later this year, and his memoir is about his childhood trauma, specifically sexual abuse by a priest when he was a boy. He sued that diocese where the abuse happened, and they settled out of court. He's now written the memoir about this experience, not just suing, but also about the childhood trauma and how he ended up recovering these memories. Well, we were getting closer to trying to figure out who was going to publish, and we had some publishers who were not willing to work with him unless he changed the name of the perpetrator. And that was really them protecting themselves, right? From the same fear that authors have, right? Of somebody coming out of the woodwork and, having a lawsuit and it costing a lot of money. So one of the things that we needed to do was really figure out like, okay, what are the legal boundaries around naming the perpetrator here? Because part of his initial motivation or mission and vision for the work or objective for the work was he wanted to take his power back by naming his perpetrator and feeling like he was no longer silenced, that like the world knew that this was this person and it wasn't this hushed account, behind closed doors, behind just him and the diocese. So it was really important to him to be able to actually name the perpetrator. Now, in our mind, for this particular situation, this was an okay thing to do because the lawsuit had been made public knowledge and this person's name had ended up in the newspapers. If anybody had just decided to Google like my client's name, right, a certain time frame and a certain area, you would have been able to find who this perpetrator was. But still, we were like, we don't know for sure. We're not lawyers. We're not going to just, say that this is common sense and check it off and move on and just find a publisher who will work with us. So there were a couple of things that we did in this scenario. Number one, we consulted with the original attorney who he used as a part of the lawsuit to ensure that there had been no NDA or confidentiality agreement that had been signed by my client during the time of the lawsuit that would prevent him from telling his story, right? That was the first kind of tactical thing that we did. We checked in. There was no such agreement. Okay, boom. Second thing we did, though, is we consulted with an attorney who specifically deals with like defamation, slander, libel issues, right? And we basically paid her for a risk assessment consultation. It was the best money we spent. And I want to say it was in the $400 range for this particular.
For peace of mind, that is worth every penny.
Worth every single penny. She not only helped us to understand like statutes and laws and things around, the parameters of slander, defamation, all that stuff, but she also then helped us assess what is the actual risk here that we're facing if we were to move forward anyway, right? And when she broke that all down, like what was the actual likelihood of them coming back at us and like this, like the benefits and the disadvantages for them actually approaching it.
Mm-hmm.
Like we kind of left the meeting feeling like even if they had a problem, they're not going to sink their own costs, time and energy into coming after him for these number of reasons, And then of course with statutes and thinking about statutes, there weren't really anything really specific to suggest that we would be at fault.
Mm-hmm.
And because we were there on this call and we had it recorded, if something was to happen, we could actually bring forward that we had done our due diligence to do as little harm possible by naming the perpetrator, by the very fact that we consulted with two separate attorneys.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, it was the client's decision after we did all of this kind of, homework, and he decided to move forward in naming the perpetrator.
Good for him.
Now, one situation, however. So I am not saying that, like, you know, if your situation feels similar, that you should just go ahead and name him and not do your own homework. But understanding law, understanding policy, understanding parameters, understanding what the risk assessment is of the likelihood that this would happen, you know, are all things to consider. And I also think, like, if you're not attached to having to name a person, then a really easy thing to do is to decide not to name them and to change some of the identifying characteristics of them in the narrative so that people can't easily identify them. Jen, do you want to jump on there?
Yeah, that's like my mind was already thinking about something in that vein anyway, is that I heard this statistic a while ago. Where it came from, don't remember, and the accuracy unclear. So you're the memoir writer, so you can fact check me on this. But I did hear at one point that with a memoir in particular, there's like a generally accepted rule of a percentage of things that can be, I hate using the word fabricated because it's not like you're making something up, but it's because you are changing details that can identify somebody else. And so I remember hearing it was like up to 20%. And I don't know, I have no idea where I read that. It was a while ago. And that's kind of how I've operated. Of like, all right, there is some gray area where you're not lying, you're not making up a different story. You're just changing the details of what you look like or where you met or the city or town or country that something is taking place in. And I think one thing that has come up in many conversations has been, all right, if you do decide to change someone's name, which I am a proponent of, I'm also a publisher. So I feel like there's definitely risk on our side if someone does something that is, you know, that is, it's going to harm both the author and us as a publisher. So I'm a little more conservative on that side. But I don't want someone's story to have to be watered down or configured in some way that doesn't feel right. But when we think about writing about somebody and we change their name and we change identifying details, if they come forward to say that that's me, they're outing themselves that they are the person having been written about. Whereas they could have just kind of kept their mouth shut and it might not have ever turned into something. So I always kind of tell authors that too, of like, unless it's a mother, father, sister, some immediate relative where you can't really, your ex-husband or whoever it might be, that makes it a little bit more complicated. But like if it is somebody that is more of a ancillary to the story, they're the ones that have to out themselves as this person who kind of maybe wronged you in some particular way. So I feel like sometimes that does give people a little bit of peace of mind around the process.
Well, and I think too, something that we need to talk about is intentionality.
Yeah.
What's your intention of naming or not naming said person, right? So in my client's instance, in the story I just told, he had a very specific objective to take his power back because of the situation, right? There are other narratives or other experiences that we might write about where there might have been harm done to us, but maybe the intention of naming that person is to get back at them.
Yeah.
Well, that's not a good enough reason to be naming them, right? Now we are getting into a territory of it's not okay. Memoir is not for bashing or bitterness or resentment or giving somebody their due, you know, their karma or whatever, karma coming back, right? Yeah. So we have to think about, well, why do we need to name them? Is it really that important to the story or what we're doing here? In some instances, like my client, it was very important. A lot of other instances, it might not be. You can still tell a fabulous story and pack the same emotional punch, even if you change Joe to Jim, you know, or whatever. So I think we have to think about, well, why do we need to name or not name whoever it is, right? For me, with the detail piece, it's not so much a percentage, but like, can you describe them just enough that we can picture them on the page, but without knowing like their home address and their identifying birthmark, that you would be able to spot them if they were in the morgue and you were the person tapped to identify the body? Like, you know, like, do we need, you know, I think what comes to mind, and this is actually from my own memoir, I was really worried about writing about one particular ex-boyfriend in my memoir, because it took me a really long time actually to get rid of him. Like, to the point where several years later, he was still reaching out. And one of my biggest fears of putting this memoir out there was like, especially having grown up in a small town and so many people being so excited that I finally did the thing of write the book, that this was going to fall upon his lap and he was going to be easily identifiable.
Yeah.
And I was like, how can I be true and honest and also, right, not poke the bear,
Yeah.
right? Considering my own kind of safety, if you will, or just like not wanting to hear from this person while also wanting to tell my story.
Yeah.
Well, at the end of the day, I couldn't necessarily take all the details away. People who knew me and knew that period of my life, they knew exactly who I was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
However, I didn't mention his name at all. I called him an ex-boyfriend that was a major regret. Like everybody knew who I was talking about, but I didn't give him a name. I didn't necessarily say what street he grew up on. I said, I think I said he lived across the street, but people would have had to know where I lived in order to know where he lived. And I didn't name my street, right? I mentioned he was a few years older. I mentioned that my parents didn't like him. Okay. Everybody can generate their own illustration of a guy that you bring home that your parents don't like, or any partner that your parents don't like, right? Whatever the case may be. So I chose to go light on those details, and people who knew me knew, but most people had no clue who this person was.
Right? I think that's the thing though, right? Because like anyone who knows you will know that, will be like, oh, of course she's talking about so-and-so. Like it would make sense that she's talking about so-and-so. But the average reader, and if we're doing our jobs right, the book is going beyond our individual network, right? It is going beyond. And so like, even if we look at some of the best-selling memoirs that are on the market now or in the past 10 years, unless you like know them, you don't really know who they're talking about. And so, and I think that's the art of good writing and good storytelling, is that you're able to be able to get your point across. And yeah, of course, someone who grew up with you and you're talking about your childhood, of course they're gonna know who you're talking about. But we can't be writing for them, like thinking about that's who's gonna be seeing it. But we also do need to protect ourselves at the same time, to your point.
100%. Well, and actually, so still using my memoir, Dear Universe, I Get It Now, as an example.
Oh, this one?
Yeah, that one with the shiny awards. I just realized my copy doesn't have a second award stamp on it.
Oh, you gotta fix that.
I cared more about the copy I sent you than the one that I'm keeping here right next to me. What was interesting is, so he was kind of a dead giveaway because of people knowing me, even though I didn't really mention a lot about him. But teachers that appeared on the pages, kids that appeared on the pages, I can't tell you how many times people who have read the book and know me have said, was that teacher so-and-so, or was that teacher me? I hope it wasn't me. Or was that my son you were writing about, the one who said the thing, you know? And I just look at them and I smile and I say, well, I guess the whole point is that you don't know, right? That was the whole point. Like, this was not to air out anybody else's mistakes or dirty laundry. Yes, they were a part of some big moment for me, but it wasn't about those people. This is my narrative. So maybe, Jen, actually, we can segue into like, what is relevant to share about another person, right? Versus what is like you dipping into a little too far, like sharing stuff that nobody else needs to know about them.
Yeah, I think that is probably one of the most common conversations I have with our authors who are writing memoirs, because it is a very fine line between what is your story to share versus what is their story to share. It is a very fine and blurred line often. And if I think about my memoir that came out in 2020, I will, good old House on Fire here.
Wait, stop. I have to show people this. Okay, no, not this. I mean, this is great, but like, people, can we just take a look at the side here? Flames.
But you gotta fan the flames. You gotta fan them.
It's just the most brilliant freaking thing I've ever seen. When Jen's book arrived recently, because we finally got to do book swap, which is why we're holding up each other's books like super fangirls. I was drooling over this. I was like, all right, next book I do, I'm publishing with Jen, so I can get some fancy stuff happening on the pages. Okay, anyway, back to the regularly scheduled programming.
Yes. I love that we are fangirling. We were fangirling privately, which just shows what nerds we both are, by the way. And I'm here for it. So when I wrote my memoir, a lot of the content covers my sister and my ex-wife. And it's really hard to write about both of those types of characters, if you will. And it was very hard where I had to make decisions on a regular basis where I was like, okay, is this my story to share or is that her story to share? Is this mine or is this hers? And I kept having to ask myself that over and over again. But if we look at the writing process, I always think of it like an ice sculpture, right? Where you start off with a big hunk of ice and you gradually have to kind of like carve it to shape it into whatever thing you're trying to create. Yeah. And so every pass you go through, you start to see like, okay, that's not mine. I'm gonna remove that story. That's not mine. I'm gonna remove that story. But with my memoir, it is my story. But the whole second half of it is very much intertwined with my ex-wife. And there's nothing negative about her written in it. And I went to her ahead of time and I was like, by the way, I wrote this thing. I'm going to publish it in a couple of weeks. And I gave her a copy so that way she like had the kind of first chance to look at it. And I had a number of people who know me and know the whole story. And they're like, wow, I thought that was interesting that you didn't include this or you didn't include that. Like I had a number of people who were like, huh, that seems like a big omission. And I'm like, yeah, because it's not my story to tell. If she wanted to go write her version of the story, it would be from her perspective. The story would still dovetail and be very much the same story. But there are a lot of things that were just not my place to share her business, right? Like, even though we were in the situation together, it still wasn't my place to share her side of whatever was happening, because it's my memoir, not hers, right? And so it is going back to, like, she and I have a good relationship, so there's not like a trying to be like vindictive or anything crazy like that. But there are people who are writing about an ex who was really abusive, or, you know, like I actually mentioned, similar to how you did it with the ex-boyfriend, I mentioned a first girlfriend I had that was just the colorful details I provided was enough, because anyone who knew me in my 20s was like, yep, that's who that was. So it's like different though, right? Because you can be really vague with one person and you can be really descriptive with another person. And both of those things can show up in the same book without there feeling like a mismatch or a lack of consistency or cohesion to the reader.
100%. But this is also why working with a really great coach editor, you know, is going to help you say yes to this, no to that. Yes, you can do that in this instance, but over here it's lacking. We need more. You know, the way that I look at like relevancy of information or detail, depending on the case, right, is does it advance the story, or does it help the reader understand what's happening in the moment? If it does neither of those things, it's likely something that doesn't need to be there and can be cut, right? You know, because at the end of the day, we don't need a full body description to picture a person, right? We don't need to know height, weight, color hair, color eyes, like way they dress. You can give us a couple of details and we can start to work out an image on our own, or you can sprinkle those details throughout the book if they appear more than once. In other places, right, if that person, as you put it, is ancillary and they're only going to come up one or two times and they're not really a central character to what's going on, you can probably get away with less is more. Because, you know, why waste a bunch of time describing somebody who's only going to appear, you know, a couple of times. So, you know, and when you're giving information, right, you only need to give the information that ends up contextualizing the dynamic that you have with them. So like, here's another example. I had a client that I was working with who was explaining kind of how her mental health diagnoses and upbringing, like the way that she was raised in a particular family dynamic, kind of shaped her to interact in her relationships in a particular way. There was so much stuff about these other people. Like, she felt like she needed to tell everything she could about the other people in order to explain why the dynamic in relationship was unhealthy, and she was repeating past behavior. But we were getting too far into the other person's details, you know, what she knew about that person being in an abusive relationship, or you know, spending all of the money, or, you know, mooching off of other people, you know, and not having good financial health, or, you know, whatever it was. And I was constantly saying, you know, what is important to the dynamic that you had with them? What were some of the things that maybe she did with you as a friend? We can't have you airing out that she was in this type of relationship unless that type of relationship somehow bleeds over into the unhealthy dynamic that the two of you had together. Right. And it can be really hard to kind of parcel things out and determine what's mine, what's theirs, when you are so close to the experience that you think everything about them has everything to do with you, right? because of the tightness or closeness of
Mm-hmm.
the relationship or whatever it is. And so I really think when it comes to using people's names or not using people's names, or honestly just choosing who goes in the story,
Yeah.
and then deciding how you name them, really comes back down to authors understanding what the hell it is they're trying to say.
Yeah.
Because if you don't know the center point of your memoir, if you don't understand what it's actually about, if there's no main thread or theme, right, you could be telling 100 different stories that don't relate to one another with thousands of different people all in there.
Mm-hmm.
And it comes down to like almost none of them being all that important, right? So then you're worrying about changing names or changing details when really you've got a bunch of stuff in there that doesn't even belong.
Yeah.
So, you know, a lot of this, I think, gets tethered to understand what you're trying to ultimately say. What's the universal element of the story? Because that's your filter for like, does this person belong? Do they get a moment in the spotlight, if you will?
Yeah. And I think on that, it's also like let me start with the story. So one of our authors a while back was writing about basically coming out, and he was writing about a past relationship with a woman that and I'm pretty sure it was an ex-wife that didn't work out. And he's describing the relationship in detail, and it was absolutely appropriate. It made sense given that he was talking about like coming out gay later. He had one paragraph that made him seem like such an a-hole. It was just this one paragraph. And I was like, you cannot include that. And he was like, why? It's what happened. I'm like, yes, I know it's what happened. But up to this point in the book, the reader has empathy for your situation. The reader has context of your relationship, her relationship. The reader feels for both of you. When you include this quasi-abusive scene, if you will, it makes you just seem like an a-hole that deserves whatever comes next. And I really had to like wrestle with him to get him to see that by including just this one little thing that did not advance the story in any way, it is only going to make your reader hate you potentially. And I think that that's something to think about too when we're thinking about, again, when you know what direction your story is going, you know, it's easy to say this stays, this goes. But on top of it, we do want to have some sense of how is the reader going to perceive me as the author? And how is the reader going to perceive some other people that I might have written about? So if you don't want somebody to walk away hating the person that you're writing about, whether it's a sibling, a parent, a spouse, then you have to be mindful of how you tell that story. So that way they don't pass their judgment onto that person. And I feel like that is also a very, very difficult balance, which is why working with skilled professionals can really come in handy.
100%. And not only would that one paragraph potentially have made readers hate him, but they might have also begun to distrust him as the narrator, right? Wait a minute, I just got to page 85, completely eaten up everything that you were saying. This one hot moment, like, now makes me think that maybe you were the problem the entire time, and these first half pages are actually just BS. And now I don't want to keep reading because I'm not even sure if what you're saying is balanced and true. Right.
That is 100% what was happening.
Now that brings up a whole other can of worms, however, and this is something that I talk to my clients about all the time when they're in their manuscript development. You cannot be wholly good and your villains cannot be wholly bad, because that's not reality, right? So when it comes to choosing details, when it comes to writing about other people named with their real names or changed, your character descriptions and the way that they come to life on the page still matters. Your villains need to be redeemable in some way, shape, or form, and it doesn't have to be a lot, and I can talk about that in a second. And you also can't be like Mr. or Mrs. Little Perfect, okay? Like, you just can't, because we're not. Humans are not perfect beings.
It's not relatable.
So nobody will believe it, first of all, and it will likely slant the narrative to come across as whiny,
entitled,
repetitive, entitled, vengeful, I guess. I kind of like revengeful, even if that's not really a word. You know, so you have to be balanced on the page, you as the narrator, but also the other characters. And, you know, it can't be one-sided. Like, memoir is for introspection and reflection and self-awareness and looking back in the rear view and being like, oh, I guess I didn't realize that I started to drift into the middle of the road, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, crap. You know, here I was this whole time telling myself that I was in the right and nothing was my fault.
Yeah.
And that's not to say, like, in memoirs that are more about trauma or that kind of thing, that you need to be blaming yourself as the victim. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that you're going to look back on that trauma with more objectivity than when you were experiencing it. You're going to look back and you're going to have more ability to make meaning from what you've been through than you were when you were experiencing it. Which also means, however, that all of the characters who came into play along that journey that you're now writing about deserve the same objectivity. Correct. And looking back at them too with like a clean slate and hypothesizing or wondering or being curious about who they might have been in that moment, right? Yeah. Because if you're doing that for you, you got to do that for them. So, you know, and this goes back to the fear piece. So our authors get fearful about naming people and writing about people. And some of the time I think it's because they haven't quite stepped back to say, well, yeah, just because they might have been a jerk during the experience doesn't mean that I actually have to write them that way, because there's a lot more to do here than to just put the reader in the moment and experience them being a jerk.
Yeah. 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 And, you know, on the fear side of things, on a more like just practical level, when we think about naming people, from a process standpoint, I always tell people, like, wait until the end. You don't know what stories are staying or going. Don't even bother trying. I had a friend who published a Kindle version of her book first and then was so excited. I was like patiently waiting to read it. And so she sent it to me kind of beforehand. And I forgot what the name, I think it was like Matthew and Matt. And she had renamed the person throughout the whole way, but she did a find and replace, but had called him Matt in one place and not Matthew. So must have been in reverse, where Matthew wasn't picked up and it was still there. I'm like, by the way, I think you left your ex's name in here still. And because of the find and replace. So I think, you know, if we wait until the end, that is helpful. But also, like, you use the like Joe or Jim. I always tell our authors to find a name that doesn't even remotely come close to who you are writing about. Because if you are writing about a Rachel and you call them Rochelle, everyone knows who you're talking about. You know what I mean? You have to be writing about an Ally and
no, they don't, Jen.
And I made this mistake myself. I'm not even going to lie. And I'm not going to say what the real name was or the name that I used in my memoir. I obviously had to change it because I'm like, Jen, what are you, like, I noticed it. I'm like, what are you doing? Everyone's going to know who you're talking about. So point being is that we want to find names that aren't even remotely in the same wheelhouse. So that way people aren't able to easily put the pieces together. But again, if you're like, I even thought about, mine takes place in New England, in Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. And I was like, I could just lift up the map. I even tried doing this. It was a disaster. So I stopped. Lift it up, just place these 3 states in the Midwest, somewhere in like Illinois, Michigan, you know, Wisconsin. And geographically, like the way I was thinking about it, I'm like, that would work. But I'm like, the culture is different. Everything is just so different, just to like remove it. But I've had plenty of people know exactly what I'm talking about, like exactly where I'm talking about in my book, because they know the geographic landscape. But it's not like the location is not really pertinent. You know what I mean? It's just more of like a backdrop, even though I did change the name of, you know, towns and cities and, you know, whether it's a beach or a pond or whatever it could be, all of those are changed too. So I think that's something we need to think about as well. It's not just names of people. It's also names of schools, towns, institutions of any kind. Like if you're writing some kind of book that is speaking ill about a hospital system, for example, you might want to figure out how to further make the distinction of that you're not actually talking about that hospital system, especially if you're writing about things that are a little bit more. Yeah, that is also kind of like a big piece. Or even like you were saying before, like this is applicable for nonfiction books too. And one like best tip I can provide is that when I wrote my first 4 books are on LGBTQ marketing and communications, like from literally a decade ago. And the first one flat out slanders the company that I was working for. And I have spoken internationally on the horrible workplace experience I had working for this company. But what I did is I made sure that company does not appear on my LinkedIn. So I never say their name. I never give the specific type of business within the larger industry. And I'm always vague enough. Like you can still say like it's an insurance company, right? Without specifying what type of insurance or location. And I share that because so often we will have like, I worked with this client and they were the worst and this, that, and the other. And then you go to their website and there's a client page and you're like, oh, wait a minute. They talked about a food and beverage company and Coca-Cola is here listed as a proud client of theirs. Or you go to their LinkedIn and it actually directly says that they were working for whatever company. So we have to it's not just the book itself. If we want to really protect ourselves, we have to make sure that our other kind of footprint on the internet is also in alignment with that. Because if someone really wants to take you down and they're like, oh, I just looked at Jen's LinkedIn, it says directly who she worked with. That's just adding insult to injury for no reason, because we can absolutely control those things.
Yeah. And I think, so I'm glad that you brought up like places and institutions and business names and things like that. I think I often err on the side of, unless a very specific location or business name absolutely has to be used for some reason, I will say things like, small New England town, or, I got my undergraduate degree, at a liberal arts college, Christian slant. I don't know, there's ways to talk about the things so that people kind of get a sense of, who or what they're talking about, without necessarily having to go and know, okay, it's that university, that hospital, that office. I think in Dear Universe, towards the end of the book, I talk about working in an academic publishing company. I don't name it. I just say academic publishing, right? North American office in Burlington. And I talk about the software company that I worked for. Now, I didn't take that company off of my LinkedIn profile, but I also chose very carefully what details I shared about the company that, I worked for, to ensure that while it wasn't my dream job, I didn't slander them for the grievances I had, within the book. And I haven't had an issue. The book's been out for 4 years. Nobody from there has come to me and said, hey, we've got a big beef with, whatever.
Because that's our job as an author, is to write about people in an appropriate professional way. And in the case of my LGBTQ books, I had just such a horrible discrimination experience in the workplace that it really was a story that was like a catalyst to the work that I was doing. So, and there's no way that anyone could figure out who that company is, because I wouldn't say with a small branch office in blah, right? Whereas, but in your case, if you're writing about, and you're not writing anything ill, and you're not, it's not an expose, no one's going to care to even try to figure it out.
Yeah. Well, so actually that brings up a great point, right? Think about it. If you're worried about something, yet the way that you've written it has not been at all negative, then you're stressing over things that don't really matter. It's when you're starting to, provide a negative review perhaps, or some criticism of, right, or grievances, that's where you want to start kind of paying attention to what you're sharing and how you're sharing it, and then all of those parameters around it. Certainly there are things that we should air out that people should not be doing, that are not okay, right? But you still want to cover your own butt at the end of the day and be able to continue to promote your message, promote a better way for the world to act, right? And you're not gonna be able to do that if you're, and you're just in stupid legal battles, because you could have changed a couple sentences and done things a little bit differently. Now that being said, right? So Jen, you were talking about some practical tips about wait to do the search and find and replace till the end of the manuscript. Similarly, your first few drafts that are not going out there for anybody else to see, nothing matters in those. Let the shit fly if you've got to. All right? Have the cathartic dump all over the page. Say all the things you say. Be raw, be vulnerable, be angry, be bitter, be revengeful, my new word. Be all the things that you want to be in the first few drafts, okay? Because nobody else is looking at them, and they're not for public consumption at that point. So that's the other piece. Sometimes people won't start writing the book because they're so caught up and worried about all of this aftermath and the end result that they won't start. Well, you're a long way away from consulting with lawyers and attorneys and thinking about slander and defamation and pissing Aunt Tessa off. All right. You're nowhere near that, because you don't know what your final manuscript actually looks like by the time you're done all of the editing, revising, and development. So say what you've got to say, go through the process of cleaning it up and polishing it, getting it to its final state, and then see where you're left to what to deal with, and then take your steps from there. beautiful example. So couple springs ago, I went to this kind of like yoga retreat center. They do a bunch of personal professional development stuff. And Elizabeth Gilbert was there as one of the speakers. And somebody asked her a question because they were working on their memoir and they were struggling with this very thing. They were having a hard time figuring out how to write about something deeply personal about people in their life that were still around. And she wanted Elizabeth Gilbert's advice. And Elizabeth Gilbert had this beautiful expression, and she said, draft from the wound, revise from the scar.
That's beautiful.
I will never forget that. And it will stay with me the rest of my life because it was like, whoa. And then she shared this experience writing Eat, Pray, Love, which she kind of became known for, right? And it became not only an international bestseller, but also a freaking movie. And she said that the first draft of Eat, Pray, Love, there was a whole bunch in the very beginning that was just dripping with resentment and bitterness about her ex-husband, who she leaves at the beginning of that book. And after she got it all said and done and all written, and she was able to take some time to step back, she was able to see that there was way too much of that in this draft, that was not at all what the book was about. This is not what the readers would want. It's not how she wanted to come across on the page. And so she said, if any of you have now read the book, she was like, you will see that almost none of what I wrote originally appears in the final version of Eat, Pray, Love. I don't even name him, and you don't even know what he looks like. Yet you know that she's going through a divorce at the beginning of the book. And she said about it, right? So, we got to kind of check ourselves. Some of the fear and discomfort and challenge around some of these questions are putting the cart before the horse. You haven't even written the whole manuscript yet. You have no idea yet what you're going to say or how you're going to say it. And the first way you say it doesn't have to be the last way you say it.
It often isn't. And I think about this a lot. I try to, and for example, so we have a writing program that's kind of like a 6-month intensive program to get people to write their draft, right? And in it, I share examples of all right, this is what mine started looking like, and here's what it came out as. And I tell authors this all the time, because if we think about that ice sculpture analogy, right, where if you have a hunk of ice and you're trying to create a koi fish, you are not going to spend all of this time perfecting its eyeball when it is still a giant heap of ice, right? It's not going to be a block of ice with this beautifully carved eye at the top, right? It's just not how this process works. And so I think the more we can remember that, the more freedom we can experience, where we're like, I'm just going to data dump it. It's going to be a shitty first draft. I'm just going to get the thoughts out there. Because if you are working with a skilled team, whether that is a writing coach in a program, solid editors with the right publisher, whatever that configuration looks like, nobody is going to allow you to publish something that is going to be damning in the ways in which we're talking about. It is when people choose to self-publish, which I am a big believer of, but a lot of people choose to self-publish and then they don't go through the proper editorial channels. And then all of a sudden something comes out and then they've pissed off everybody around them. And it's like, if you were working with the right team of people or any team of people, it wouldn't have gotten to the place where that rawness would have actually, where the wound would have landed on the page, right?
Yeah. And this is also why your publishing team should include a lawyer. Right? Because even working with the skilled coach or publishing support, whatever it may be, editor, they don't know the legal boundaries, to bring our conversation full circle. They don't know the legal boundaries of where the line is for slander and defamation. And if you have or have not crossed that line, so you need those people too. And it could mean that you highlight the manuscript, the sections where you're the most concerned, right? And send it to them to look at, to cut down on them reading the whole thing and charging you, tons of money for their hourly, service. But you should still do it if you're really in that lane of, there's a lot here that potentially could be harmful to both me and to somebody else. Whether they deserve it or not is not what we're talking about. Not what we're talking about, right? You should really have an attorney also as a part of your team. Stop. It does not hurt to have the legal perspective and the peace of mind.
I couldn't agree more.
This is going into the world, and you don't know who it's going to land in front of. You don't know if the people that you're worried about are watching what you're doing and just not saying anything, or not. You know, that's kind of both the excitement and terror of
Yeah.
the digital age. Your book can reach a great many. Your book can also reach the people that maybe you were hoping would overlook it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. It's
So-
tricky. You know, we've published almost 200 books, and we've only had to have one full legal read from start to finish of a book before. And they were also writing about big corporate, you know, big corporate America, basically, and the hazards in which, so it made sense for them. Like, they made an investment, and it was a sizable investment to have someone legally read, you know, 70,000 words. Every other author that has come up with this, I have a couple of attorneys that I'm like, hey, go have a conversation with so-and-so. They'll give you the right guidance. And it's as simple as that. So like, I don't want people thinking, you know, also that like, oh my God, it's going to be like this big, I have to hire somebody to actually do a legal read on this too, because that the reality of that being needed is so far and few between. But getting the guidance and getting the green light from someone who knows what those ramifications are, that is not just me or you, even though we do have a lot of experience and we do really understand this, at the end of the day, we don't know the nitty gritty nuance that could be the difference between having a problem and being fine.
Yeah. Well, and so to go back to the example I used at the very beginning, so the legal consultation that my client and I had, you know, with his book, we sent a specific list of questions. We sent a PDF of the manuscript, notated. These are the sections, right? Mm-hmm. So they jumped to the sections that were highlighted that had the comments. So they weren't sitting and reading all 350 pages or, you know, whatever it was. So not only could our conversation be focused, the bill could be lower, we could get exact questions, you know, specific questions answered. So, you know, yeah, I don't want anybody to walk away from today's conversation thinking that they've got to, you know, put down get a loan from a bank to have a lawyer look at it and to give you worthy advice. So I see in the comments, we've got Laura and we've got Alan in the comments. And so since we are rounding up to the hour, I want to just jump in here and say hello to you both. And if you have questions on this very hot topic that we're getting all, you know, fiery about, then, you know, please drop them in the comments for us to answer before we wrap up our show.
Yeah.
Jen, anything else that we should drop in here from our own experiences, perspectives, before we call it a day?
I think the only thing I would say is just write it, right? Like, write it and figure it out later. Make this a future Ally problem, a future Jen problem. Like, future iterations of yourself can handle the things. But like, if you really are compelled to write a memoir, or you're really compelled to share certain stories in your nonfiction work, just focus on writing it and making sure you have the right people around you to help you fix whatever you start with later. Because I think it's one of those things that I think really trips people up and gets people to not take action. And if we think about how many people don't proceed and write a book because they're fearful of things that really in many ways don't even need to be feared, I think the world could be a better place if we could all just focus on like, all right, I'm just getting this out there. So that's what I tell the writing students that we have, like, just say, like, just write it. This is a future you problem. You can figure it out at a later date. It doesn't have, you don't have to write it perfect now. And to your point before, like, what you start with versus what comes out later, sometimes it's like 50% is now no longer there. And if you spend an hour tweaking one paragraph, which a lot of people do, because it's like this need for control is what I have seen. Or what I've also seen is that you have a manuscript that the first like 3 chapters are perfection. And then the last chapters are a disaster because they focus so much energy in that linear way of like, all right, I'm going to chapter 1. I want to make sure this is perfect. And every time you open up that document, you're landing right back at chapter 1. And so people keep tinkering and tweaking it. And then you have an editor come in and be like, oh yeah, that's not relevant. We're taking out, 3 pages. And like, that's not fun, especially when you know you've spent so much time crafting the perfect phrasing and it ends up not being relevant to the bigger story arc.
Yes.
I just say, just write. This is a future. Yes, you should be concerned. Yes, you should, want to make sure that this is done well and done right. However, don't let the unknown stop you.
Yeah. And celebrate the fact that you are concerned, because the fact that you're concerned means that you're thinking about all the right things and you're not just going into something blindly or doing it purposely to do harm to anyone else. Like, you're being intentional, you're having integrity about how you're going about things. So, definitely congratulate yourself for even thinking about these things, right? Because that's really important. And I want to piggyback off of what you said, Jen. So like if we were to break this down into like three things, like three practical takeaways from today. So number one, just write the freaking thing, okay? Which is what Jen was just talking about. Two, after you write the freaking thing, that's when you're looking for where is it relevant and where is it not. That's your filter for whether or not something stays or goes, okay? Write the freaking thing, then determine what's relevant and stays or goes. And then third, consult with your editor, consult with your publishing team, consult with a lawyer, like consult until you feel without a shadow of doubt, you got this and you're feeling really good about what you've produced and that it says exactly what you want it to say in a truthful, honest, and authentic way without creating further issues for yourself later on down the road.
Well said.
Okay, so Laura says, hello, very helpful. Names will be changed. It's not my intention to hurt anyone telling my story. A small subset will know who the real people are, and that's okay.
I love that. I love that. That's okay. I'm hoping that clarity may have emerged from this discussion. Like, it is okay.
It is okay. Yeah. You're not going to, we all have inner circles. We're not going to keep all the details away from our inner circle or the people who were there experiencing the thing that we're now writing about. The only thing we can do is our diligence to choose our words as carefully as possible, to walk that fine line between being honest and authentic in our truth and also not trying to hurt the other people who come onto the page, right?
Try not to cause harm.
The one thing that we didn't really talk about, so I'm shoving it in here at the end, right, is when you've got public knowledge of something that has happened, you're not really at risk of having dragged somebody else's name through the mud when it's like identifiable through a public, right? Newscast, news article, search results on the web. Maybe you've got something in writing. You can prove that the thing that you just said is true, right? Those types of things are also things to take into consideration, right? Because they cover your butt. Like, you're not making it up. You can find that exact information or data somewhere.
Yeah. And that's why sharing our story is the most important thing and not someone else's version of the story, because then we are anchored in our own truth of our experiences and what happened. That, I think, is what saves our butts as well.
Yeah. So before we go, we are, of course, going to flash our memoirs across the screen one more time. We have put the links to these in the show notes. So grab Jen's House on Fire, Finding Resilience, Hope, and Purpose in the Ashes. And don't forget to flip the pages so you get the flame.
Yes. Bring on the flames. And then yours is Dear Universe, I Get It Now. Letters on the Art and Journey of Being Brave and Being Me. When I picked this up, I've obviously seen your book like all over the place before. I didn't physically touch it. I was like, oh, I love the way it feels. Like, I just love the matte finish, and it just has like that nostalgia, which is obviously what you're going for here. So like, not even knowing what the contents are, I'm like, oh, nostalgia, love it. But can we also just take a moment and celebrate your book baby, because I'm finally holding her after all of these months.
I know. Book
baby.
Oh
my God. And
like we went to like a motherhood circle, and now we're just like, here, you hold my toddler while I hold yours.
Literally. Yes. Yours is, I literally told one of my authors yesterday about your book. I was like, if you're looking for another perspective, it says the same thing, but just from a slightly different lens. Go pick this one up. He's like, all right, maybe I will.
Yeah. I just love how similar they are. It's just so crazy. Like,
even the design, outside design.
Oh my God, this is just ridiculous. Like, bold print, bright colors. Yep. They're like the same length. I do have to say that I am just envious of the 4-color print in here. Oh my God.
She ain't cheap. I will tell you that.
Yeah, no, that I believe. I mean, I know mine isn't. It's black and white, so I have to imagine yours is up there. So folks, we are wrapping up today's Unscripted with Ally and Jen. Continue to drop things in the comments, because we will see that things came in after the fact. Thanks to Laura and Alan for being here, and anybody else who is here that we just can't simply see at the moment. We're going to be back in June on Friday, the 14th at 1 p.m. Eastern, and we look forward to jumping in with another great topic with y'all then.
Beautiful.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next month. Bye.